Will NBN Co's write-down of $31 billion lead to cheaper broadband prices?
And what will it do for the future of broadband in Australia? Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support.
Hi there. Welcome back to Vertical Hold Behind the Tech News, the award-winning tech podcast where we catch up with Australia's leading tech journalists to dive into the big tech stories of the week. I'm Alex Kidman, joined as always by Adam Turner. Hey Adam, this week Apple Music introduced an exciting new feature. Well, maybe not that exciting. In classic Apple fashion, it's taken an existing product and put an Apple logo on it.
And pretended they invented it?
And this time it's karaoke, of all things, with Apple Music Sing. And Adam, look, we've known each other a long, long time now, and it's only now that I realise I don't actually know your go-to karaoke track. So, after a few quiet bevies, what do you pick when it's your turn at the mic?
Oh, you do, because everybody's seen this, unfortunately. After a few beers, I'm always keen to belt out Satisfaction by the Stones and strut around like Jagger. And I apologise once again to all the tech media who had to witness that in an event a few years ago. It still pops up in my Facebook memories, but that is my go-to karaoke song.
I'm feeling like we could make money out of selling that video, but maybe the licensing would be a bit killer. We're also joined this week by veteran tech journalist Nick Ross. Nick, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
So, Nick, I've seen you have a couple of drinks over the years, but equally I don't recall ever seeing you sing. Do you have a go-to karaoke banger?
I'm very weird on this. I don't sing in English because I can't sing, so I'd sing like foreign songs or try to because they're a bit more forgiving. You can get them wrong and no one knows. So it'd be like Plastic Bertrand's Ça Plaît pour moi
Wow.
or Nina's original 99 Luftballon.
Yeah. Good choices. And look, I'd sometimes go those myself if I wasn't going a little Prince, which is mostly my go-to genre, I suppose. But we are not, in fact, here to entertain you with our renditions, or in my case, manglings of classic tunes. Instead, this week, we turn once again to our soup du jour, the NBN. Yes, folks, it's all still happening with the National Broadband Network. And like Adam and I, Nick's been covering the NBN since its inception, both the highs and many lows, and he's here to chat through NBN Co's plans for the future. But first, we caught up with our sponsor, Aussie Broadband, and their CTO, John Reisinger, to talk, oddly enough, about the future of the NBN.
So the NBN is one of Australia's biggest tech stories over the last 20 years, and it keeps making headlines. To dive into the latest details, we're joined by John Reisinger, who is Chief Technology Officer with our podcast sponsor, Aussie Broadband. John, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Adam.
So the NBN seems to be at yet another crossroads. We've had a change of government, led to another rethink when it comes to technology, when it comes to finances. The NBN was originally set up on this idea that it would pay for itself, so the government didn't need to treat it as an expense. That might have changed, though. We're seeing talk that perhaps they will sort of write off, although they don't want to use those words, write off a big chunk of it, which means that it doesn't have to make quite as much money to cover its expenses. If that goes through, what does that mean for the future of the NBN in terms of pricing, in terms of technology?
Look, I think it certainly provides a lot more freedom for them to do some of the things that to improve and keep up with the times. So, for instance, if you look at the Fibre Connect program that they're doing now, where previously to change from FTTN, so their phone line based NBN to a fibre connection would cost multiple thousands of dollars, whereas the Fibre Connect program only requires you to go up to a higher speed plan, such as the 250 megabit plan, and they'll bring the fibre in for you if you're in a location that supports it. And then that sort of thing brings better capabilities to more of the country, and allows them to bring those faster speeds to places that won't necessarily didn't have them in the past.
Do you think that could maybe see them tear out more copper as well?
Look, as time goes on, I expect that they'll get more people get onto fibre, and at some point, it's probably it's going to become so far through the place that that it'll be almost trivial to put it into the rest of the space in a given area.
The part of the NBN that seems to get skipped in this discussion, and it is only part, is the cable side of it. Do you see? I mean, is there, from a technological standpoint, is there a future in this? Because it seems, whilst it has obviously bumped up to mostly gigabit, technically capable. I have some horror stories I could tell. It seems to have hit that kind of cap. There doesn't seem to be much more they can do with it. Am I on the wrong track there?
Look, I think that's going to very much depend on where consumers want to go with that. There it's I think it's certainly one of the ones that's less that needs to be worried about less. I think the Fibre Connect program for FTTN is certainly that's where it needs to be, because that's where the slower speeds are at the moment. So
it's a much bigger slice of the NBN pie for sure.
Absolutely, and it's not getting those gigabit speeds until you get them onto that fibre.
One of the things that we've talked about for a long time is the pricing with the NBN and how it's broken into different segments, including the CVC. How might that change if this plan goes through?
The new SAU went out to the ACCC yesterday, and part of that is about getting rid of CVC overage for 100 meg and above plans. So essentially, for anyone who's on 100 meg and above, it will mean that that they can use what they need to use, and it doesn't incur extra costs to the RSP when they go over what's included in the current bundles. The bundles will still continue for the 50 meg and below, but the 100 meg and above will turn into essentially a fixed cost from NBN.
Am I right in thinking, though, that 50 meg is still the most popular plan? So by doing this, the majority of users still miss out on the benefits?
Look, certainly 50 meg is still a very popular plan, but I think as well as the CVC will progressively disappear through till 2026 from those plans. But it's also an opportunity for as households use more and more data, especially with some having multiple screens, it's an opportunity for them to go. Maybe there is an opportunity to shift to one of the higher speed plans.
So this kind of two-tiered system, how technologically challenging is it for an ISP to balance that? Because presumably right now you've got to balance CVC across all your plans. You've got to try and provision as best you can for all of your customers.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, you've presumably got the above 100 chunk where you can just go, right, have at it, and then the below 100 chunk where you've got to do more balancing.
So one of the other changes that comes about with the SAU is previously CVC has been built on you had to order a certain amount of CVC and you paid for that, and people worked within that. What they're going to do for the 50 and below is they'll move from that to a what's being used amount. So, for instance, if you had a 10 gigabyte, what they call an NNI, so a physical link, you may only be buying 4 gigabits of that, and you paid for that 4 gigabits. And if people use 4 gig, then it started getting congested. Now, if you need to burst above that and go to 5 or 6 gigabits, it will just charge you for what you use, and that makes it a lot simpler from a management perspective, because you don't have to guess and plan what customers are going to use. You let them use what they need to use, and get billed for it appropriately.
That sounds like the same way that actual consumer plans have changed in the last few years to make it easier for them.
I mean, certainly for the 100 and above, it is where it's essentially becoming an unlimited plan with a single cost. And the 50 and below, it's sort of an interim step essentially until they can get to the point where they remove the CVC from them as well. But yeah, certainly as time goes on, it will realign with what kind of consumers are paying. The way consumers are paying for internet plans.
And presumably that kind of simpler and more affordable scaling should also mean consumers may get a smoother experience in those peak evening hours where congestion does sometimes happen.
Yeah, because you're not having to essentially purchase the amount that you think they're going to use anymore. Yeah, you can let it rip essentially, and let them use what they need to use at the time. So yeah, I believe it should have an impact in those. I mean, look, people, certainly there's been a lot of work done to reduce that that sort of congestion from what it was a few years ago. But this should help a lot more.
So when most people think about the NBN, they think about the link running to their house, because that is pretty much what it is, the link that runs from the local POI, the point of interconnect. I keep wanting to say point of interest because I'm writing about GPSs. But so from that, what maybe used to be your telephone exchange to your house. But Aussie's also doing some upgrades in other areas to add more fiber as well. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, essentially, you've got the link from your house, and for some people that will go directly back to the telephone exchange. For most people, it will actually go, say for instance, FTTN. It will go to a node, which then goes back to the phone exchange by fibre, or FTTC. It'll go just down the street, and then back to the exchange, or fibre. It'll end up at the exchange through a essentially an interconnect point, of fibre access node. What we've done is we've actually run our own fibre out to 79 of these points of interconnect. So there's 121 points around Australia, and everyone comes back to one of those. And we've, rather than having to purchase bandwidth out to those points of interconnect from a third party, we've now got our own direct fibre to their back to our data centres in the cities.
Was that purely just an economic question of not having to pay to use someone else's links, or are there other benefits to doing that?
Yeah, look, there's definitely other benefits. So what it allows us to do is essentially put in more bandwidth quicker. So previously we've had to we've been relying on third parties, and they've got to put the link. They've got to put any links that we get in themselves, and so there's a time period associated with putting those in. Having our own fibre allows us to. We can because it reduces the cost to get out there. We can actually put in more earlier, and if we get to a point where our links out to the POIs are starting to fill up, we can connect new ones relatively quickly. Sometimes within a couple of weeks.
Where does the NBN? Where do you think? And feel free to do just whatever crystal ball gazing you like. Where do you think the NBN goes from here?
I think look, there's always going to be a case of having to essentially upgrade it as time goes on, because at the moment people look at 100 megabit and go, yep, that's pretty fast, and the more advanced the techies go, okay, gigabit, yep, that's fantastic. But as time goes on, you're seeing in other countries already that they're providing 10 gigabit services out to customers. So technology is it doesn't stop. It's always marching on, and so as we move into the realms of VR and possibly even 8K HD and those sorts of things, there's going to be requirements for even more bandwidth. So fibre, from the point of view that there's fibre in the ground, it's fairly good from a an upgradability perspective, but there is quite a thing in having to go through and then replace all the stuff on each end of it. So I think that's where things are going to move in the future, is basically adding more speed and just making sure that it's that we're on the forefront of where internet technology needs to be.
Well, it looks like it'll be very interesting to see where the NBN goes from here, which I think we've been saying for the last 15 years or so. But yeah, thank you, John, very much for making the time to talk to us.
No, thanks for the opportunity.
So, as we said before, we've been talking about the NBN for a long time. And no matter how you sliced it and diced it, this thing was going to cost a lot of money. Now they're talking about a write-down of $31 billion, but they won't call it a write-down because that's a very loaded term. But they're basically saying, oh, well, if it loses $31 million, we can look the other way.
Billion, sir, not million.
$1 billion. We can look the other way. Nick, Is this a big deal? And why won't they call it a write down? What is wrong with that phrase?
Well, there's going to be political reasons behind that. Basically, the term has been so avoided by the Libs saying it for the past 10 years that it's the first person to actually admit that they need to do it is just going to get hammered for it. So even though it's being written down because of total Liberal Party failures, the second Labour says it's a write down, it's going to say, oh, you failed, you're writing it down. And it's pretty sad, really. But it's inevitable because it needs to be written down. You can't spend $60 billion on a turd and expect people to want to pay for it.
So basically, a write down means that we're just saying, okay, we're going to call that an expense now and we're not going to make it back. But instead of having a write down, they're just saying, okay, we're realizing that we're not going to make 30 million of it back, but we won't call
billion.
it
You keep getting that
billion.
wrong.
The numbers are just too big for my head. But yes, so it's the same basic outcome. They just want to word it differently.
Well, I guess the simplest way of looking at it is that they've spent 60 billion on something that's worth 20 billion.
Yeah.
And if that. And so there's a huge discrepancy there of 30 billion. And the reason they're doing it is because currently, or at the end of the last government, NBN Co was told you have to make all that $60 billion back by charging all the customers you've got to a huge amount of money to do it. And of course, they didn't want to pay that much money because the service was by comparison rubbish and not even remotely worth it. And that was a completely unsustainable business model. And so because we didn't have all the fiber, which would have been worth an absolute fortune, paid for itself many times over, and there's no business case to actually support paying for a $60 billion network. No one's, and if they want to sell it, they can't sell it for $60 billion because it's not worth remotely that.
Well, I was going to bring that up actually because the language around it, and you're right. I mean, I think the Productivity Commission valued it at $19.5 billion, if I recall the numbers correctly. Right. But the language that the government's been using around this has been an awful lot more of we're keeping it as a national utility now, rather than we're selling it anyway.
I've not followed the latest politics, but from what I've been seeing, nothing's changed in the past 10 years. The problem being that the original reason for doing it in the first place was it was national infrastructure, which would have benefited every single walk of life, industry, healthcare, education, the lot, paid for itself easily. And then it got transformed into a kind of consumer tech. You can access the internet a little bit faster for cheaper money, and all those, or many of those business benefits which would have paid for it all went. So you're only left with like consumers paying and the odd business paying for a pretty poor service that didn't cover the bills.
And even the Productivity Commission, which tries to be neutral on these things, came out and said that it was that switch away from mostly fiber to the multi-technology mix model is the key reason why it's not worth as much and why it's costing more to maintain, yes?
That's completely it. I mean, the multi-technology mix from Malcolm Turnbull, also called Malcolm Turnbull's mess, never added up. And the numbers around it were just, I don't want to say lies, but I've said it enough publicly. They were just false and untrue and effectively lies. I can't understand how they got away. Actually, I know exactly how they got away with it, but they weren't true either way you look at it.
Looking at the picture now as well, I mean, it's problematic. Part of what they threw into the current special access undertaking that they're trying to get through, which includes this write-down that isn't a write-down, were the numbers around things like copper faults, which is what you get with the fibre to the node solution. And it's something like 4 times as many as they're having with fibre. There's still problems with fibre. Fibre can still break down. But copper's so much more problematic, which means, of course, it's also so much problematic, not just that it's there now, but to keep it there now and working.
Oh, well, copper, you say it's 4 times more faults. It's gargantuanly more than that. And not only that...
That's based off their SAU figures. They say, I've got them in front of me at the moment. Their fault volumes were something like, in financial year 2022, were 27,000 fibre to the node faults, as opposed to 7,200 fibre to the premises faults. So this is presumably the stuff they've logged. These are, reasonable
it's
sort of numbers.
It's tricky to say. I mean, 10 years ago, put it this way, when they had to procure Telstra's network, and we were talking to one Telstra senior engineer who was in the field, had been for 30 years, and he said it's rooted. And typically what would happen is that an engineer would come along to fix a copper fault. They'd do it in the cheapest, quickest way possible because of various union things, and Telstra were evil back then. And whilst fixing a copper fault, they'd make 2 or 3 more. And then the next people would call up, the same engineer or a different one would come out, do a temporary fix and break some more stuff, and then bring it back in. On top of this, you had things like there was a water sealant nationwide system that was supposed to stop water ingress into copper and protect the cables. And then after rolling that out to much of the country, they found out that the water sealant was reacting with the water that was already in the cables and corroding the cables, making things much, much worse. On top of that, you had Malcolm Turnbull acknowledging that the copper network was so terrible and that you wouldn't actually offer new builds use copper. They'd put in more fiber, and then he ended up buying 61,000 kilometers of new copper. And I guess with all that remediation for the past 10 years, then if they've only got the fault rate down to 4 times more than fiber, that's pretty impressive. But I mean, it was catastrophic before, and God knows how much they spent on it. I wouldn't even be surprised if that wasn't covered in the 60 billion fee they paid. Not entirely, anyway.
So, in terms of the write down, we've kind of talked, in fact, at considerable length on the show about the financial model of NBN Co requiring that return and so on. That write down, does that just make the balance sheet look better for NBN Co, or does it actively enable them to then say, right, everyone's NBN plans can be, $10, $20 cheaper per month because we don't need to pay so much back?
I think it's definitely going to help give an excuse to make the price lower, because they couldn't do that before. They were literally tasked with repaying the money the government had given them, $60 billion of it. So they had to charge huge amounts. But now the government's reduced 30 billion of that by writing it. They've written it off, but from NBN perspective, it's a write down. Now they can charge less, and that means there'll be more adoption and more things that can be done with it. And that will benefit most people and businesses, but it's not going to change the fact that the infrastructure itself is pretty poor, and it's already being overbuilt and competed with by other parties, mobile carriers, and Elon Musk.
When it comes to NBN pricing, one of the most controversial things that we've talked about is this CVC charge, basically like a capacity charge on top of every connection. Is that something that they'll likely do away with now, and what difference will that make?
Yeah, that's at the heart of this write down, really. It's the CVC charge that they charge all we used to call them ISPs, they're RSPs now. That's where they pay for the bandwidth. And that was the figure that was so high that then the RSPs would have to then raise their bills to the customers, cut their margins, and that they didn't like that. And the customers didn't like it because their bills went up. So no one was really making any money. The expensive, fast plans weren't as adopted as everyone hoped they would be, because there was nothing really that you could do with them. And so people didn't want to pay a premium for a poor product. And now at least the price will come down, and on the surface we'll get lower bills, because you know that the wholesale providers do want to lower their bills, so that lower CVC price will translate into lower bills. Probably not straight away, but you might see a whole bunch of marketing campaigns where it's switched to us because we're cheaper now, and that will usually be a house of cards for price falling.
So I suppose the other side of this, especially in consumer land, we've seen these very fixed, rigid price structures, but also speed structures. Obviously, it depended a little bit on the technology you'd get, and what you actually got down the line might have been something very different again as well. But do you think this opens the door for us to have some more variable speed structures, so people who want faster uploads could get those, or people who don't care so much could cut that for downloads? Are consumers going to get more choice, do you think, outside of their ISP in terms of the NBN speeds they get?
To be honest, I don't think so. The prices for plans will come down, but when the infrastructure is bottlenecked by its own limitations, what can you do? With fiber, if you wanted 10 gigabit because you were running an office somewhere or out of your home, or you needed it, you're you work at home on like 8K movies for America. All that would have required, if you had fiber into your home, was a few extra connections at each end of the fiber, a few more electronics, and you could do it. But you can't suddenly just upgrade kind of fiber to the node system without serious infrastructure costs, and especially when there's copper nearby and involved. And some people will be lucky; they'll be in places where they can suddenly get an upgraded service. But I can't see most people doing it because you're limited by the quality of the infrastructure, and it's not very good generally.
As we've gone along each step of the way, at least when we've had Labor and Power, they've added more and more fiber and stripped out more and more copper. We've had another round of that with the latest change of government. Do you foresee a future where they will ever tear out all of that fiber to the node, and maybe not go fiber to everybody, but at least people will be on like HFC cable or fiber to the curb or something, but no copper in the network?
It's really hard to say. I know from when I was covering it very intensely about 10 years ago that the network topology used in the fiber network, the MTM one, the liberal one, was actually kind of done in a way, intentionally or not, which would have made upgrading it actually very difficult. And so going back, you might actually have to think about ripping out fiber to add more fiber in many instances, which is a pain because then you've got to justify that in a toxic political environment and with a hostile press. And what you're going to do, I don't think Labour would ever want to touch it again. I mean, they've tried and failed. They never really sold the benefits, even though they were massive to the country in the first place. So it's going to it gets into politics again. I mean, fiber to the home is very, very obvious, and anyone who says otherwise is either doesn't know what they're talking about or is just politically compromised. It really is straightforward. I've done the due diligence, wrote it all up, no one wanted to hear it.
So we are seeing more fibre, at least, which is a plus for those that can get it. And I know they're now talking, I think, from next year about starting to implement multi-gigabit speed, starting to sort of catch up with where the rest of the world has got to in a lot of places. But do you think we'll actually see that next year, or is this another one of those, look, you'll get it when you get it kind of NBN promises?
It's really hard to say now. The main benefits of the original fiber to the home uh, uh, structure and network and policy was that once everyone's got it, then all of these amazing services and benefits and industries will flourish. But everyone has to have it first. So the idea of being the first person to get cheap fiber to your home, unless you've already got like a specific uh, circumstance you need it for, whether it's, I don't know, telehealth or your business doing, again, high resolution video editing, then those are the only kind of use cases you'd need it for, really. For everyone else, there's not really any reason to have it. But if we all had it in the first place, then it would have succeeded brilliantly because the industries are all excited, ready to go. But that's gone now. So you'd be having a super fast connection, but you wouldn't really have too much that you could do with it. A bit like consumer 5G, by the way.
Well, I was going to get onto that because this is, I guess, the other competing space where we're seeing, especially Telstra and Optus, do an awful lot of promotion of, hey, you're sick of the NBN? Come over to 5G.
Yeah, and it's infuriating. And the reason being, if we had a nationwide fiber structure, then any telco that wanted to put up a 5G mast could have done so. And that would have mean that we'd have loads of different choice, loads of different providers, much lower prices, and no black spots all across the country for 5G wherever there was fiber. Instead, and we could have charged the 5G providers a lot of money, as in a really serious lot of money for using that fiber. Instead, we got rid of it, and now they've built their own fiber on top of all of this. So, like the bad old days, you've got the same streets have got NBN infrastructure and fiber from the likes of Telstra and Optus to their 5G masts. And 5G is very, very efficient. There aren't really any consumer benefits so much from having it over 4G, but from an infrastructure point of view, it's absolutely brilliant because you can have millions of devices attached to it, far less power to actually connect them. It's really efficient, and you've got guaranteed bandwidth speeds, which better than copper, frankly. So if you can have 5G attached to your home, and lots of little private operators are doing this now, yes, there's now going to be loads of competition because, again, the NBN infrastructure ain't great and everyone else is overtaking it.
So the 5G thing is interesting, though, and this does get a little more anecdotal, which is obviously fairly dangerous. But certainly from some of the things that I've been told by readers, listeners, and so on, those who have switched to 5G have had very mixed experiences with it because it is still that wireless connectivity. It is still variable, depends where you are, depends on the building, depends on the tower, and all of that. And I'm certainly seeing myself at least a little bit of consumer blowback on 5G as being this wondrous kind of solution to it versus fiber. But you're not wrong. The copper solution is even worse.
Oh, completely. And I think the problem with 5G, and I remember when Telstra first announced it, and they were the first announcement, and I asked them straight off at the conference what the benefits to consumers for having it that you can't do on 4G, and they said basically none. But as with every generation, well, that's not fair. With every other previous generation, there were some obvious benefits with reliability and speed, but with 5G, they had to really make up benefits that were better than 4G so they could charge more for them initially, even though the main benefits of operating 5G network is it's much, much cheaper to operate from an operator's point of view, and it lets you do all kinds of absolutely awesome things with IoT, smart cities monitoring, and it turns out also offering consumer home broadband.
So speaking of competition in the bad old days, one of the ideas was with the NBN that they could build it up and eventually sell it off. This talk again that perhaps they could sell it to Telstra. Wouldn't that put us right back where we started?
Yes, it would be the dumbest idea ever and just shows that man learns nothing from history other than man learns nothing from history. And it's, yeah, can you imagine if that happened? And the thing is, of course it's going to happen. It's just so stupid. It's got to happen, and they'll get it at an absolute bargain as well. And it's pretty sickening, especially the way it all went down the first time when Telstra shouldn't have ever sold it to NBN Co at all. And God, people should go to jail for that one. They were just flat out lies, but no one's really wanted to look into it.
But it's Telstra's the reason why we built the NBN in the first place, because Telstra couldn't be trusted to run a national network because they abused the fact that they own the infrastructure. So they said, all right, let's buy and build a new infrastructure that isn't controlled by one telco.
There were plenty of other reasons for that as well. I mean, it was that Telstra was invited to do this, and eventually the whole deal collapsed, and that was when
Well, to dive back into that history, they put in something like a 12-page tender. It was tiny for building what was meant to be, in fact, at the time, a fiber to the node network, a copper-based network. But this was 2007, 2008, something like that.
Even earlier, yeah.
Yeah, it was earlier than that.
They basically said, look, we'll do the paperwork because we have to, but we're not basically that interested in doing it.
Yeah, they were writing off copper long before NBN was even announced. And it was only when all of the private partnerships collapsed, proposals collapsed, that Conroy and Rudd were on that plane and designed the thing on the back of a napkin, like so many other famous inventions. But of course, that back of the napkin, for those who still think that's a real thing, got turned into a very, very large implementation study by some very large people. Was it KPMG McKinsey? That was big. And then, we basically threw that away after spending, 15 million on it, and built the MTM. I tell you what, if NBN originally started on the back of a napkin, what did MTM start out on the back of?
Well,
paper comes to mind.
Moving from the history to the future, Nick, unless I'm very much mistaken, you're broadly very pessimistic about the future of the NBN. Where do you see Australian broadband going in a world sense in, say, the next 5 to 10 years?
It's really hard to say. Much will depend on whether Labour have got the chutzpah to basically start again. And they may as well start again because we need nationwide fibre. However, it's looking very much like the private sector may get there first, which means like the old cable TV days, but for worse reasons. We'll have areas of coverage where there isn't coverage and others where it's really good. Massive fluctuations in price, monopoly issues. And of course, that means that the services that could have developed, like especially rural telehealth care, would have been huge, is not going to be as likely to take place. Smart cities and power distribution, which we need more than ever, they're less likely to happen because there's a fragmented load of suppliers now rather than one centralized fiber network. And all those benefits aren't really going to happen. But, in the more profitable areas, like with cable TV, you're going to get good services and they'll cost more than they should have.
So if we declared you El Presidente tomorrow, what's the first thing you'd do to try and turn this around?
I'd actually do some decrees about the media and them just flat out lying about it. But really, you've got to the simplest thing would be, you've got a report by KPMG McKinsey, start again with that. It's not this that it was like peak funding of 45 billion. It started paying for itself long before it was finished. The net cost, doing the healthcare benefits, it paid for itself many times over at that. And you may as well just start again. We all know that, fibre to the home is what should have happened. Even Turnbull said all the time that fibre to the home was the end game. And his reasoning being, we've just got a more efficient way of getting there, which is what turned out to be complete falsehood. We knew it was. Whether he was lying or literally convinced himself of that, only he knows.
Well, that just about wraps up this week's episode of Vertical Hold. Thanks to Nick for joining us.
No worries, anytime.
And Nick, it's time for you to face up to the patented, cat-friendly Vertical Hold 3 questions of doom. I will ask you all 3 questions in a row, and you can answer them in any order you like.
Okay.
Where can people find your work online? Where can they find you on social media? And our current big contentious question, what's the worst non-journalism job you've ever had?
Oh, don't say non-journalism, because we all know the worst job he's ever had.
I'm not going there. I want to know more about Nick. I know the answer to that one, so I want to know more about Nick.
Okay, so the main place you can find me, I've started my own sites recently. I've got High Performance Laptops, which reviews and does news and features about laptops. I've just launched a small business tech site called smbtech.au. I'm doing all kinds of freelancing for pretty much everyone: Tech Radar, APC, IT Wire, and Connected AV Magazine, audio visual. Who knew? That was amazing. For social media, probably Twitter is my best place. Nick Ross Tech. That hasn't changed for a long time. And my worst non-journo job, I've had a lot of non-journo jobs, I think it's actually got to be in various marketing, the pure marketing places, which is weird because we talk to a lot of marketers all the time. But when you're, I think, a full-blooded journo, you're going into a full bullshit industry, it clashes. It certainly did for me. And I've had just 5 years of absolute horror shows in that. And I'll combine the whole marketing industry, leaving aside PRs who are lovely, but the straight marketing advertisers, I can't function with them. Sorry.
You seem like such a shy, retiring type too, Nick.
I've been through the mill so much. I'm very well counselled and have learned to address lots of anger issues, but I now use my anger in the right way as a pure motivating factor. And also, there's not a lot said about me that hasn't been said already, so I just don't care anymore.
Staying positive is, I think, always good. And as always, if you want to catch us at the Vertical Hold team online, you can catch us at Vertical Hold AU on Twitter, on the Vertical Hold Facebook page, or at verticalhold.com.au on the web.
And thanks again, everyone, for listening in, whether you're on fibre or 2 tin cans and a piece of string. We appreciate you dropping by and helping us spread the good word in 2022. Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support.